The chandeliers above glowed with golden brilliance, scattering light across the ballroom like captured stars. The polished marble floors reflected each shimmer, amplifying the grandeur of the evening. Wealth was everywhere. Men in hand-tailored tuxedos adjusted their cufflinks with idle pride. Women draped in shimmering gowns let diamond bracelets catch the light with deliberate flicks of the wrist. Waiters floated through the crowd in crisp uniforms, balancing trays of champagne that glowed pale gold in crystal flutes. Every movement in the room spoke of money, power, and legacy. Among the sea of wealth, a young woman lingered near the champagne fountain. She wore a dress of emerald green, elegant but modest compared to the jewel-toned extravagance of the crowd. Her hair was pulled back in simple waves, her makeup subtle, her jewelry understated. She was not there to dazzle with ornaments but to observe, to take in the theater of excess before her. Her eyes moved from face to face, taking in names she knew only from news headlines and magazines, banking heirs, shipping magnates, media darlings. There was a quiet calm to her presence, a strength that needed no jewels to announce it. The Harrington family spotted her before she noticed them. They entered the ballroom like they owned it, heads high, shoulders squared, exuding the arrogance of old money unchallenged for generations. Charles Harrington, the patriarch, wore a tuxedo cut with military precision, his silver hair slicked back, his chin raised as though the world itself bowed beneath his feet. His wife, Vivian, glided beside him in a crimson gown heavy with sequins, each step calculated for attention. Their son, Preston, tall and broad-shouldered, trailed close, his smirk already fixed in place, as if he had been born sneering. Charles leaned slightly toward his wife, his voice pitched just above a whisper but sharp enough to cut through the music. "My God, Vivian, do they really let anyone in these days? Look at her. That dress, what is it? Department store chic?" Vivian chuckled softly behind her jeweled fingers, eyes flicking dismissively toward the young woman in green. "It's dreadful, isn't it? Off the rack, no doubt. She looks like she stumbled in by accident." Preston tilted his glass, gaze narrowing with a cruel amusement. "Probably some assistant trying to mingle with the big players. Doesn't belong in this room. You can smell desperation from here." The laughter that followed was low but poisonous. Their words carried far enough to be heard by the one they mocked. The young woman's back stiffened as she caught every syllable, but she did not turn immediately. Her hand lingered near the base of her untouched champagne flute. Her jaw tightened once, then released, her eyes steadying as though she'd reminded herself of something important. With quiet grace, she set the glass down on the white linen tablecloth beside her and turned away from the fountain. Her footsteps were measured, deliberate, her posture straight as she slipped into the crowd. To anyone watching, it looked as though she had simply grown bored of her spot. But her silence, her refusal to acknowledge their sneers, carried more weight than words ever could. Charles smirked with satisfaction. "See? Even the help knows her place when reminded." Vivian touched his arm with mock sympathy. "Let her learn. Nights like this remind people of their station." Preston drained the last of his drink, pride swelling at the invisible points he believed he had scored. They didn't notice the faint whispers that followed in their wake. A few guests had overheard, though most avoided becoming involved. Yet one or two pairs of eyes lingered on the Harringtons with faint distaste, quietly noting the exchange. The gala was not just a celebration, it was a stage, and in stages, every gesture was remembered. The music swelled, violins rising as the crowd shifted toward the central space, where a stage awaited beneath a wash of white light. Waiters hurried to clear glasses as the master of ceremonies prepared to introduce the announcement everyone had come to witness. The Harrington family straightened their jackets, lifted their chins, and smiled with the gleam of those who believed destiny bent to their will. The air buzzed with anticipation. Investors leaned in close to each other, murmuring about the record-breaking $850 million deal, a merger expected to reshape the market. Journalists clutched their pens tighter, hungry for the headline that would travel across the globe before sunrise. Unnoticed by most, the young woman in emerald slipped out of sight, vanishing into the ebb of bodies, her face unreadable. The empty space she left behind near the champagne fountain seemed insignificant to the Harringtons. To them, she had been nothing more than background clutter, an extra in their script. But her departure set something in motion, a ripple in the evening's flawless surface. Preston glanced once toward the fountain, sneered, and shook his head as though dismissing a bad smell. Ballrooms like this are for those who matter. The rest are just props. Charles chuckled at his son's bravado, pride swelling at the arrogance he'd carefully cultivated. Exactly, Preston. Remember that. As the lights dimmed slightly to focus on the stage, the Harrington family prepared to step into the glow of history, blind to the irony that history had just stepped past them quietly, wearing an emerald dress. They laughed, satisfied with their own cleverness, certain that they had put an unworthy intruder in her place. What they didn't know, what not a single one of them suspected, was that the woman they mocked was no assistant, no desperate hanger-on, but the daughter of the CEO whose signature they had spent years maneuvering to secure. And as the master of ceremonies tapped the microphone, drawing silence over the glittering hall, the Harringtons smiled like conquerors unaware they were already standing on a crumbling cliff. The ink on their empire's next chapter had not yet dried, and already, it was trembling at the edges. The gala reached its height, the atmosphere alive with champagne-fueled chatter and the rustle of silk gowns against marble floors. A pianist struck gentle notes in the background, underscoring the anticipation building in the air. This was not just an evening of glitter and photographs, it was the night where a family name was to be carved into history. The Harringtons thrived in that spotlight, moving through the room as if every eye existed to acknowledge their importance. Guests circled them, eager for a handshake, a quote, a glance that could tie them closer to the empire Charles Harrington promised to expand. Charles basked in it. He stood tall with the ease of a man used to deference, his laugh booming, his stories cutting the air in crisp edges designed to remind others of their wealth's permanence. Vivian, poised and regal, accepted compliments with a tilt of her chin, her crimson gown shimmering like a warning flame. Preston loomed at their side, his glass refilled constantly, his smirk as polished as the shoes that reflected the ballroom's lights. Together they looked untouchable, surrounded by the buzz of inevitability. The master of ceremonies soon called for attention. The crowd hushed as Charles strode confidently toward the stage. His steps were deliberate, timed with the swell of applause that filled the ballroom. He took the microphone with a smile of ownership, as if the room itself had been built to honor him. Tonight, he began, his voice steady and commanding, marks the beginning of a new era. With the finalization of our partnership with CEOâ Technologies, we stand ready to revolutionize global logistics. Together, we will shape the future. Applause echoed, though it carried more politeness than passion. Investors whispered to one another, some nodding, some merely waiting for the true star of the evening to appear, the woman whose signature carried the weight of $850 million. Evelyn Carter, the elusive and commanding CEO of CEOâ, had yet to arrive. Whispers darted across the ballroom. Where was she? Why hadn't she been seen? The Harringtons didn't worry. They believed the stage was theirs. Vivian raised her chin higher, certain the cameras would capture her as the evening's jewel. Charles continued with the flair of a politician, and Preston leaned lazily against the stage's edge, grinning at a pair of young women watching him with hesitant admiration. It was then that Naomi reappeared. She had been absent long enough to escape their notice, but when she returned, she positioned herself at the edge of the ballroom, close to the stage entrance, where shadows softened her presence. She stood tall, her emerald dress catching the light, her gaze fixed calmly on the family that had mocked her only minutes before. Preston saw her first. His smirk widened, and with deliberate cruelty he tilted his head toward her. "Look who's back!" he muttered loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. His voice carried, dripping with derision. "Our champagne girl again. Should have stayed in the kitchen or stuck to bussing tables." A chuckle followed from a cluster of sycophants nearby, the kind of laughter that stung more than the insult itself. Naomi didn't flinch. Her eyes remained calm, her posture unyielding, but a faint silence spread as others noticed the cruelty. The sting of the words lingered in the air, turning heads toward her. Naomi's expression didn't crack. Without a word, she turned from the stage and slipped behind the curtain. To those watching, it seemed like defeat, like someone walking away from humiliation. Preston grinned, satisfied. Charles, half distracted, didn't even notice. Vivian's lips curved faintly, pleased that the intruder had removed herself once more. Moments later, the energy shifted. The hush that spread wasn't for Charles's words, but for the entrance at the back of the hall. The tall, commanding figure of Evelyn Carter moved into the room, and with her came a silence heavier than any applause. Heads turned. Cameras flashed. Her midnight blue gown seemed to draw the very light of the chandeliers to her, her presence alone commanding respect. She walked with the assurance of a woman who needed no introduction, and those who had been whispering moments earlier now held their breath. And beside her walked Naomi. Gasps rippled like waves across the ballroom. The same young woman mocked and dismissed not once but twice now walked proudly at the side of the CEO who held the fate of the Harringtons in her hands. Naomi's emerald dress no longer seemed plain. It gleamed like a statement, her simple elegance amplified by the weight of truth now unveiled. Charles froze on stage, the color draining from his face. Vivian's crimson-painted smile faltered. Preston's grin collapsed into disbelief. Evelyn strode directly toward the stage, her daughter's hand resting lightly in hers. She embraced Naomi before the room, pressing a kiss to her cheek. The gesture was deliberate, protective, and proud. Then she took the microphone from Charles with calm authority. "Before we proceed," Evelyn began, her voice resonant, commanding silence across the hall, "I must address something deeply troubling." Her gaze swept the audience, sharp as glass, unblinking. "My daughter, Naomi Carter, was mocked tonight. Here. In this very room. Not by strangers, but by the family that expects me to sign an $850 million deal with them." Gasps filled the air, louder this time, mixed with whispers that cut through the ballroom like blades. All eyes turned to the Harringtons, who stood stiff and pale, their practiced smiles shattered. Charles stepped forward, desperate. This is a misunderstanding," he said quickly, his voice thin compared to Evelyn's steady tone. "Surely." Evelyn raised her hand. The interruption silenced him as effectively as a gavel. Her eyes didn't leave his. Naomi stood at her mother's side, her posture regal now, no longer quiet and overlooked. She lifted her chin, her presence undeniable, her silence heavier than words. The audience shifted, murmuring, watching, weighing every second. The Harringtons had entered the evening certain of victory. Now the stage had turned into their trial. The silence that followed Evelyn's words was crushing. Guests who had laughed at Preston's insult minutes earlier now avoided eye contact, unwilling to share in his shame. Investors studied the scene with new calculations forming in their minds. Journalists scribbled furiously, already composing the scandal for tomorrow's headlines. And as Evelyn's voice rang out again, calm but sharp enough to slice through the room, the gala shifted from celebration to reckoning. The Harringtons had believed themselves untouchable. Yet in that moment, it was clear they were one word away from losing everything they had built. The silence in the ballroom was suffocating. The chandeliers still sparkled above, the pianist's hands hovered frozen over the keys, but the music had stopped. All that remained was the sharp edge of Evelyn Carter's words still hanging in the air. Her presence radiated authority, her midnight blue gown seeming darker, sharper, like armor forged for this moment. Naomi stood steady at her side, her emerald dress gleaming beneath the lights, her calm expression a direct contrast to the panic flickering across the Harrington family's faces. Charles Harrington cleared his throat, his usual baritone voice suddenly gravelly, stripped of confidence. "This must be a terrible misunderstanding," he said, forcing a smile that failed to mask the tremor in his jaw. His hands twitched slightly as he adjusted his cufflinks, a gesture meant to steady himself, but it only betrayed his unease. "We would never deliberately insult." Evelyn's gaze locked on him, sharp and unyielding. "A misunderstanding? My daughter was mocked. Her presence questioned. Her worth dismissed. And it wasn't whispered behind closed doors, it happened here, in front of your peers, under the glow of chandeliers, in a ballroom filled with people you sought to impress. A ripple of murmurs surged through the crowd. Every guest had their eyes fixed on the confrontation, their interest no longer in the deal's numbers but in the drama unraveling before them. Charles's wife, Vivian, stepped forward, her crimson gown catching the light as she attempted a graceful save. "Surely, Evelyn, we can move past this. Business is business, after all. Emotions should not cloud an opportunity of this magnitude." She forced a laugh, brittle and hollow. "We've all had too much champagne tonight. Words get twisted." Naomi's voice, calm and firm, broke the silence that followed. It was the first time she had spoken since the ridicule. "It wasn't twisted. I heard every word. My dress. My presence. My place." Her eyes met Vivian's without flinching. "If this is how you treat me in a ballroom surrounded by cameras, how would you treat the people who can't defend themselves? The ones who work quietly in your shadow?" Her words carried, quiet but undeniable, threading through the hall like truth carved into stone. A murmur of agreement rose from the edges of the crowd. Guests exchanged glances, nodding subtly. The Harringtons' arrogance, once admired by some, now looked like rot exposed beneath a polished surface. Preston, red creeping into his cheeks, muttered under his breath, but his anger pushed the words louder than he intended. "She's overreacting. It was a joke. She should learn to take one." The reaction was immediate. Gasps. A low hiss of disapproval. Guests pulled back from the Harringtons as though the air around them had turned toxic. A woman in a sapphire gown near the front whispered harshly to her husband. "Did you hear that? In front of everyone?" A well-known investor muttered. "Unprofessional. Disgraceful." Reporters' pens scratched furiously, cameras lifted, shutters clicking like hammers driving nails into the Harringtons' coffin. The story was no longer about an $850 million merger. It was about power, prejudice, and humiliation played out under the world's gaze. Charles spun toward his son, rage flashing in his eyes. "Enough!" he barked, his mask of civility cracking. But the damage was already done. Preston's words had echoed too loudly, sinking their family further into the quicksand. Evelyn's expression didn't shift. Her voice remained steady, calm, but her words cut deeper than any shout. "You asked me to trust you with a partnership that would impact thousands of employees, millions of customers, and yet, in your arrogance, you reveal what you truly are. You cannot see beyond your own reflection. You cannot respect dignity." She glanced at her daughter, then back at the crowd. "Business is integrity. Without it, money is nothing but paper and glass." Vivian reached for Evelyn's hand in a last attempt, her jeweled fingers trembling. "Please, let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. We are friends, Evelyn. Allies. Surely you understand the world we operate in." Evelyn pulled her hand away, her rejection deliberate, her eyes never leaving Vivian's. "I understand more than you think. I understand that my daughter was humiliated by the very people who expect me to sign away trust. And I understand this. There is no deal large enough to make me forget who I am or what I stand for." Naomi touched her mother's arm lightly, leaning close to whisper something only she could hear. Evelyn listened, her eyes softening briefly, then gave a single nod. She turned back to the microphone, her face once more carved from stone. "Effective immediately," she said, her voice rising, firm and final. "Negotiations with the Harrington family are terminated. CEOâ Technologies does not do business with those who degrade human dignity." The words landed like thunder. Gasps tore through the hall, louder this time, layered with the rustle of silk gowns, the scrape of shoes on marble as guests shifted in shock. The Harringtons stood frozen, the collapse of their empire playing out in front of an audience that would ensure the world knew every detail by morning. Vivian's painted smile broke, trembling at the edges. Preston's fists clenched, his arrogance finally faltering into fear. Charles's face drained of color, his jaw working as if words might still save him, though none came. The crowd began to move, their energies shifting away from the Harringtons like a tide receding from a crumbling cliff. Investors who had been circling them moments earlier now drifted toward Evelyn, eager to align themselves with her strength. Reporters surged forward, questions flying, flashes blinding, capturing the Harringtons' humiliation from every angle. On stage, Evelyn stood tall, her arm around Naomi's shoulders, her presence unshaken by the chaos. Naomi, once mocked as out of place, now stood in the very center of the storm, her calm dignity revealed as the true inheritance of her family's legacy. The Harringtons had believed themselves invincible, untouchable. Yet in one evening, arrogance had undone them, not through numbers or contracts, but through words spat carelessly at the wrong person. The ink that had been meant to sign away the future of their empire now turned to ash in front of them. And as the ballroom erupted with whispers, questions, and alliances shifting like sand, the Harringtons could only stand frozen, watching everything they had built begin to unravel. The ballroom pulsed with noise now, the energy transformed from glittering celebration to a frenzy of whispers and shifting allegiances. Cameras flashed relentlessly, their bursts of light catching every flinch, every tightened jaw of the Harrington family as they stood in the glare of exposure. Guests who had once orbited them like satellites now looked elsewhere, gravitating instead toward Evelyn Carter and her daughter. The balance of power had shifted in an instant, and no one was willing to cling to a sinking ship. Evelyn didn't move immediately. She let the silence stretch just long enough for the gravity of her words to settle over the room. Her glass, lifted calmly by a waiter, caught the light as she raised it. Her voice, smooth and unhurried, carried with the confidence of a verdict already sealed. To every young woman told she does not belong, may tonight remind you that she already does. To every person ever dismissed by arrogance, may tonight remind you that dignity is not negotiable. The room erupted in applause. It wasn't the polite, shallow clapping that had greeted Charles Harrington earlier. It was thunderous, full-bodied, the sound of respect breaking free of restraint. Naomi stood at her mother's side, her eyes glistening but her posture strong, the glow of vindication settling across her face. Investors surged forward like moths to flame. One of the most influential CEOs in the energy sector shook Evelyn's hand firmly. "If they've stepped aside," he said, his voice carrying enough to be overheard, "then I'd gladly put a better offer on the table tomorrow morning." Another, a woman known for commanding a powerful shipping conglomerate, added, "Your integrity speaks louder than any number. My board would welcome a partnership with Leora." The Harringtons could only watch as opportunity after opportunity slipped from their grasp, redirected like a stream breaking into new channels. Their years of maneuvering, strategizing, lobbying, all undone in a matter of minutes. Vivian's face was pale beneath the layers of makeup, her crimson lips trembling as she tried to hold her composure. She clutched her jeweled clutch tighter, whispering sharply to Charles, "Say something, do something!" But Charles could only stare at Evelyn, his mouth opening and closing like a man searching for air. Preston stood rigid, fists clenched, his face a storm of anger and disbelief. His arrogance, the sneer that had once seemed unshakable, had crumbled. Every camera seemed to focus on him, capturing his humiliation from every angle. Reporters shouted his name, baiting him with questions about his insult, daring him to dig the hole deeper. He said nothing, the realization finally dawning that every word now would be another nail hammered into their ruin. The room around them swirled with new alliances. Evelyn's toast became the moment investors remembered, the cameras captured, and the public would repeat. Naomi found herself surrounded not by mockery but admiration. Women approached her, young and old, offering words of support. "You carried yourself with grace," one whispered. Another said, "You reminded us all what strength looks like." Naomi nodded, offering small smiles, but her eyes often returned to her mother. Evelyn's presence was unshakable, a lighthouse in the storm. When Naomi leaned close and murmured, "I didn't want to ruin everything for you," Evelyn turned and cupped her daughter's cheek gently. "You didn't ruin anything," she said. "You revealed everything. And sometimes truth is the most powerful deal of all." The Harringtons tried to move, to reclaim some shred of control, but every attempt was met with cold shoulders. When Charles stepped toward a cluster of investors, they turned away without acknowledgement. When Vivian reached for a familiar socialite, the woman excused herself with a quick shake of her head. Preston tried to rejoin his peers, but their laughter had turned from admiration to mockery, whispered behind raised glasses. The family that had strutted into the gala as untouchable royalty now stood alone, an island shrinking beneath a rising tide. The night stretched on, but its focus never shifted back. Evelyn spoke with investors, Naomi introduced herself with quiet confidence, and the crowd swelled around them like a court around its true queen. The Harringtons became specters at the edges of the ballroom, ignored, unwanted, humiliated. When the music began again, it was not for them. When the champagne flowed, it did not fill their glasses. Their names, once spoken with reverence, now carried the sting of scandal. A whispered joke spread through the crowd, bitterly sharp. 850 million, gone in 8 minutes. Laughter followed, cutting like knives. At last, the Harringtons could endure no more. Their exit was slow, awkward, drenched in the glare of cameras. Charles kept his head down, his face gray with defeat. Vivian clung to his arm, her smile brittle, her eyes darting desperately for any ally who might remain. Preston followed, his fist still tight, his pride shattered but his anger smoldering. Each step they took toward the door was a reminder of the empire slipping through their fingers. Reporters shouted after them. "Mr. Harrington, is the deal officially dead? Preston, do you regret your comments tonight? Vivian, do you think your family's reputation can recover from this?" None of them answered. They walked through the gauntlet of flashes and questions, their silence damning, their retreat undeniable. Back inside the ballroom, Evelyn and Naomi stood together at the center of it all. They did not need to raise their voices, did not need to flaunt their wealth. Their presence was enough. Integrity had spoken louder than arrogance, and the room had chosen its side. Later, as the night waned and the chandeliers dimmed, Evelyn placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. Her voice was softer now, meant only for Naomi. "Remember this, Naomi. Respect is earned, but dignity is non-negotiable. Never let anyone take it from you." Naomi nodded, her chest tight with both pride and relief. She looked once more toward the doors where the Harringtons had vanished. For a moment, she thought of the humiliation she had endured, the sting of their laughter. But the bitterness faded, replaced by the knowledge that their downfall had been their own doing. She had simply stood tall and let the truth reveal itself. By morning, the headlines would carry the story across the globe. Harrington deal collapses amid gala scandal. CEO Evelyn Carter chooses integrity over fortune. Mockery leads to multimillion-dollar meltdown. And woven through them all would be the image of a young woman in an emerald dress, standing proud beside her mother, the moment captured in photographs that would become symbols of dignity triumphing over arrogance. The Harringtons would find themselves scrambling to explain, their empire bleeding credibility, their arrogance finally catching up to them. But Evelyn and Naomi would move forward with the strength of their convictions intact. The deal hadn't collapsed because of poor numbers or shaky strategy. It hadn't collapsed because of market volatility or boardroom politics. It had collapsed the moment the Harringtons mocked the wrong daughter. And in that truth lay the final, devastating poetry of the night. Arrogance had written their downfall, and dignity had signed its name. Do you want me to now polish all 4 parts into a single flowing faceless video script with pacing cues and cinematic scene transitions?